I wasn't supposed to survive that night. The pavement was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps through denim and settles deep in your bones until you stop shivering and start going numb, and I remember thinking maybe that was easier, maybe not feeling anything at all was better than the constant ache of trying to stay afloat in a city that didn't even notice when you disappeared. The streetlight above me flickered like it couldn't decide whether I was worth illuminating, casting everything in uneven gold and shadow. While cars passed just feet away, their tires hissing against damp asphalt, none of them slowing down, none of them looking twice, and I curled my fingers tighter into the sleeves of my oversized hoodie, pulling it closer like it could protect me from more than just the wind, like it could somehow hold together the pieces of a life that had quietly fallen apart. I don't know how long I'd been there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time felt different when you had nowhere to be and no one waiting. Stretching out into something shapeless and heavy, and my eyes kept drifting shut even though every instinct told me not to, not here, not like this. But exhaustion has a way of winning arguments you don't even realize you're having. That's when the sound changed, subtle at first, the low hum of an engine that didn't belong to the usual late-night traffic, smoother, quieter, expensive in a way you could feel without seeing, and then the headlights washed over me, not harsh but deliberate, like someone had chosen exactly where to stop, and I remember thinking it was strange, that a car like that would pause for someone like me. The door opened with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than the slam of any passing truck, and footsteps followed, measured, unhurried, each one landing with a kind of certainty that made the air feel different, like the night itself had decided to pay attention. And I forced my eyes open just enough to see polished shoes step into view, black leather untouched by the grime of the street, and then the rest of him came into focus slowly, like my mind couldn't process it all at once. The tailored coat, the straight posture, the stillness that didn't need to announce itself to be felt. He didn't speak right away, didn't rush, just stood there looking at me in a way no one had in a long time, not with pity, not with annoyance, but with something I couldn't name, something that made my chest tighten even through the fog of exhaustion. I tried to sit up, instinct kicking in, because men like him didn't stop for girls like me without a reason. And reasons like that were rarely good, but my arms gave out. Halfway, my body refusing to cooperate, and a quiet sound escaped me before I could stop it, something between a breath and a protest. "Don't," he said, his voice low, controlled, not harsh but impossible to ignore, the kind of voice that didn't ask twice, and it froze me in place more effectively than any shout ever could. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my thoughts scrambling for something coherent, anything that would make sense of why he was here, why he hadn't already walked away like everyone else. And for a second I thought maybe he would, maybe this was just curiosity, just a pause before returning to whatever world people like him lived in. But then he shifted slightly, and I saw it, the smallest hesitation, like something had interrupted his usual pattern, like I wasn't supposed to matter but somehow did. Behind him, I noticed movement, shadows that resolved into other men standing a few steps back, silent, watching, their presence subtle but unmistakable, and it hit me all at once that this wasn't random, that nothing about this moment was accidental, that I had somehow crossed into a story I didn't understand. "Sir," one of them said quietly, like a reminder, like a suggestion to leave, and for a heartbeat the world held still, waiting for his decision, waiting to see which direction this night would take, and I braced myself for the obvious outcome, for the door closing, for the engine fading, for the street swallowing me again like it always did. But he didn't move, didn't turn away. And when he finally spoke again, it wasn't to me, it was to them, his tone unchanged, calm in a way that made the words land heavier than they should have. "Take her with us," and just like that, everything I thought I understood about how invisible I was, shattered. I should have fought them. I think about that sometimes, about how I should have found some last piece of strength and run the second they reached for me, but the truth is I barely had enough energy to keep my eyes open, let alone argue with men who moved like they had already decided how this would end. And when one of them crouched beside me, his voice quieter than I expected as he said, "We are not going to hurt you," I wanted to believe him, not because of what he said but because of who had said it first, because the man standing behind him had not raised his voice or his hand, he had simply chosen, and something about that choice felt final. I remember the way the air shifted as they helped me up, careful but efficient, like they were handling something fragile they did not quite understand, my legs unsteady beneath me as the world tilted slightly, the streetlights stretching into long streaks of gold. And I caught one last glimpse of the sidewalk where I had been lying, already looking like it had forgotten me, like I had never been there at all. The car door opened and the warmth inside hit me first, a quiet contrast to the cold I had been wrapped in, soft leather, a faint scent of something clean and expensive, and for a second I hesitated, every instinct screaming that stepping into that car meant crossing a line I could not uncross, but then I looked back at the empty street, at the darkness waiting to swallow me again, and I realized I did not really have a choice. I slid into the seat, my movement slow, cautious, my fingers gripping the edge as if I could anchor myself to something real, and the door closed with a soft, definitive sound that echoed louder in my chest than it should have. No one spoke at first, the engine starting with barely a sound as the car pulled away, smooth and steady, like the city itself was making room for us to pass, and I kept my gaze fixed on the window, watching the blurred light streak by, trying to piece together what was happening, trying to understand why a man like him would stop. "For someone like me, what is your name?" he asked finally, his voice coming from across the space between us, calm, measured, as if this were a conversation taking place in a completely different world, one where none of this was strange. I swallowed, my throat tight, my voice barely more than a whisper when I answered, "Emily," and saying it out loud felt unfamiliar, like I had not used it in a long time, like I had been drifting without it. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable but deliberate. As if he was filing that information somewhere, placing it exactly where it belonged, and then he nodded once, almost to himself. "Emily," he repeated, quieter now, and I felt something shift in the way he said it, not softer, but more certain, like my existence had just become real in a way it had not been before. I turned slightly, just enough to see him clearly for the first time, the sharp lines of his face illuminated by passing lights. His expression unreadable but not indifferent, never indifferent, and I realized that was what unsettled me the most, not fear, not anger, but the absence of dismissal, because people who dismissed you were easy to understand, they moved on, they forgot, but this man had stopped, had looked, had decided, and I did not know what that meant. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. My fingers tightening against the seat as I waited for an answer I was not sure I wanted. His gaze met mine briefly, steady, unwavering, and for a moment it felt like he could see every version of me I had tried to hide, every mistake, every reason I had ended up on that street, and still he did not look away. "Somewhere you will not have to sleep outside," he said simply, as if that was enough, as if that explained everything, and maybe for him it did, maybe in his world solutions were that straightforward, but in mine nothing had ever been that simple. I leaned back slowly, the weight of exhaustion settling over me again, heavier now that I was warm, my eyes drifting closed despite my efforts to stay alert, to stay aware, because I knew I should not trust this. I knew I should stay awake, should keep asking questions, should hold on to whatever control I had left, but the steady motion of the car, the quiet presence around me, and the strange certainty in his voice pulled me under like a tide I could not fight, and the last thing I remember before everything faded was the sound of him giving a single, quiet instruction to the driver, "Do not stop," spoken with a calm authority that made it clear this night was far from over. I woke up slowly, like my body was unsure whether it was safe to come back yet. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the empty kind I had grown used to on the street, but a controlled silence, thick and deliberate, like every sound in the room had been filtered before it was allowed to exist. And then came the warmth, soft beneath me, steady, nothing like the unforgiving concrete I had fallen asleep on, and for a moment I stayed still, eyes closed, letting the unfamiliar comfort settle in without questioning it, because questioning meant remembering, and remembering meant facing the fact that I was somewhere I did not understand. When I finally opened my eyes, the ceiling above me was too high, too clean, painted in a shade of white that looked untouched by time, and I pushed myself up slowly, my movements cautious as the room came into focus around me, large windows stretching from floor to ceiling, curtains drawn just enough to let in the faint glow of early morning light, furniture arranged with precise intention, everything in its place, everything expensive without trying to prove it, and it hit me all at once that I was not just inside a house, I was inside a world that did not belong to me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet meeting a soft rug instead of cold pavement, and the difference alone made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. Like I had stepped into someone else's life without permission, like I was borrowing something I could not keep. "You are awake," a voice said from somewhere behind me, calm, familiar in a way that made my heartbeat pick up instantly, and I turned too quickly, my balance faltering for half a second before I steadied myself, my eyes landing on him as he stood near the doorway, exactly as I remembered, composed, unmoved, like he had been there the entire time waiting for this moment. Adrian Volkov did not look surprised, did not look relieved, he simply observed, his gaze steady as it moved over me, taking in details I could not hide even if I tried, and I suddenly became aware of everything, the way my hair fell messily over my shoulders, the oversized clothes that did not belong to me, the fact that I was standing in a place that felt too clean for someone like me to touch. Where am I? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, not out of fear but because the space itself seemed to demand it, like speaking too loudly would break something invisible. Safe, he answered, the word simple, controlled, as if it was the only explanation he believed I needed, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny but because I did not remember the last time that word had applied to me, not in any real way. I folded my arms instinctively, grounding myself, trying to hold on to some sense of control as I looked at him, really looked this time, the tailored black shirt, the sleeves rolled just enough to reveal strong wrists, the stillness in his posture that suggested he did not need to prove anything to anyone, and it made me uneasy, not because he was threatening, but because he was not, because men like him were supposed to feel dangerous in obvious ways, and he did not, which somehow felt worse. Why did you bring me here? I asked, forcing the question out before I could lose the nerve, because if I did not understand his reason, I could not understand what came next. There was a pause, brief but intentional, and for the first time I saw something shift in his expression, not weakness, not hesitation, just a slight narrowing of his eyes like he was considering how much truth to give me, because leaving you there would have been a waste, he said finally, his tone unchanged, and the words landed heavier than I expected. Not cruel, not kind, just honest in a way that stripped away any illusion I might have held on to, and I did not know whether to feel insulted or grateful, because somehow it was both. I looked away for a second, my thoughts scrambling to catch up, to make sense of a decision that did not fit into any pattern I understood, and when I looked back at him, he was still watching, still waiting, like this was not a conversation he intended to rush, like he had already committed to whatever came next. You can leave, he added after a moment, and that caught me off guard more than anything else, because it was not a command, not a condition, it was an option, placed in front of me as calmly as everything else. He had said. I blinked, processing, my eyes flicking toward the door behind him, toward the hallway beyond, toward the unknown waiting on the other side, and for a brief second I imagined it, stepping out, walking away, finding my way back to the streets I knew, back to the cold and the uncertainty that had become familiar, and the thought alone made something inside me tighten. When I looked back at him, he had not moved, not even slightly, as if he already knew the answer I was struggling to reach, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant this was never just about being brought here, it was about what I would choose now, and whether I was ready to admit that the life I had been surviving might not be the one I wanted to return to. I did not move toward the door, and I think he knew I would not the moment he gave me the choice, because people like him did not offer options they had not already calculated the outcome of, and that realization settled somewhere deep in my chest, quiet but undeniable, like I had stepped into a game where the rules were invisible but already written. I let out a slow breath, my arms still folded as if they could hold me together, and instead of answering him, I asked the only question that felt real. What happens if I stay? Because leaving meant going back to a life that had already proven it did not care whether I existed, but staying meant trusting something I could not fully see, and neither option felt safe, just different kinds of uncertain. Adrian did not respond immediately, his gaze steady as always, but there was a slight shift in his posture, subtle enough that someone else might have missed it, like he was adjusting to a new variable, like the conversation had moved exactly where he expected it to. You rest, he said finally, his tone even, almost practical, as if this were a simple arrangement, not a turning point. You eat, you recover, and the words sounded so ordinary that they almost felt unreal, because nothing about my life had been that straightforward in a long time. I let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if I had the energy for it, shaking my head slightly as I looked down at the floor, the soft fibers of the rug beneath my feet reminding me again how far removed this place was from where I had been just hours ago. That is it, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. No conditions. Because there was always a catch, always something waiting underneath the surface, and I had learned that the hard way. When I looked back up, his expression had not changed, but there was something in his eyes, something sharper now, not threatening, just precise, like he was deciding how much to reveal. There are always conditions, he said, not denying it, not softening it, just stating it like a fact that did not need explanation. And that honesty caught me off guard more than anything. Elsie had said. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly against my sleeves. Then say them, I pushed, because I would rather hear the truth than build false hope around something that was never meant to last. For a moment, the room felt smaller, quieter, like even the air was waiting for his answer, and then he stepped forward, just one step, closing a small part of the distance between us without invading it, his presence more defined now, more real. You do not disappear without telling me, he said, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that made the words settle firmly in place. You do not lie to me. And there it was, not ownership, not control in the way I had feared, but something close, something structured, something that felt less like a cage and more like a boundary I had not realized I needed. I blinked, processing, because those were not the demands I had expected, not the ones I had prepared myself to resist, and it left me uncertain in a completely different way, like I had been ready to fight and suddenly there was nothing to fight against. And if I do, I asked, testing the edge of it, because part of me needed to understand where that line led. His gaze held mine, steady, unflinching. Then you leave, he said simply, and the finality in his voice told me there would be no second chances, no negotiation. Just a door that would close behind me and never open again. The room fell quiet. After that, the kind of quiet that did not need to be filled, and I realized something in that moment that I had not expected, something that unsettled me more than fear ever could, because he was not trying to keep me here, not really. He was giving me a space and letting me decide whether I deserved to stay in it, and that kind of trust felt heavier than any force ever could. I let my arms fall to my sides slowly, the tension easing just enough for me to breathe properly again, and when I spoke, my voice was still soft but steadier now. I do not have anywhere else to go, and it was not a plea, not a confession, just the truth, plain and unprotected. Adrian studied me for a second longer, as if measuring the weight of that statement, and then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, like that was all he needed to hear. Then you stay, he said, and the way he said it did not sound like permission. It sounded like a decision already made, one that somehow included me even though I was still trying to understand it. And as he turned to leave the room, his presence retreating just enough to let the space breathe again, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about how to survive the next hour. I was thinking about what it meant to be seen, and how dangerous that might be. I did not realize how tired I truly was until the door closed behind him and the room fell completely silent, not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that wrapped around you like something intentional, something designed. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, just breathing. Just existing without the constant pressure of what came next, because for once there was no immediate threat, no ticking clock counting down to the next problem, just space, and I did not know what to do with that. Eventually, I moved, slowly at first, like I was afraid the room might disappear if I went too fast, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the dresser, the cool glass of the window, testing everything as if I needed proof that it was real, that I had not imagined the entire thing as some kind of exhaustion-driven illusion. And when nothing faded, when everything stayed exactly where it was supposed to be, something inside me loosened just enough to let curiosity take over. I found the bathroom first, larger than my entire apartment had been months ago, clean lines, soft lighting, everything placed with precision, and when I caught my reflection in the mirror, I froze, because the girl staring back at me did not belong in a place like this. Her hair tangled, her eyes tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep, her hoodie hanging loose like it had seen better days, and for a second I felt out of place in my own skin, like I had been dropped into the wrong version of myself. There were clothes laid out on the counter, neatly folded, simple but clearly expensive, and I hesitated before touching them, my fingers hovering just above the fabric, because accepting them felt like accepting something else, something unspoken, and I was not sure I was ready for that. But the alternative was standing here wrapped in the past I had been trying to survive, and I was suddenly very aware of how heavy that past felt. The shower was warm, steady, and I stood under it longer than I should have, letting the heat seep into my bones, washing away the layers of dirt and cold and exhaustion that had built up over days I had stopped counting. And for a moment I closed my eyes and let myself believe that this could be normal, that this could be something I deserved, even if I did not fully understand why. When I stepped out, wrapped in a towel that felt too soft to belong to me, I felt lighter, not different, not fixed, just less weighed down, like I could breathe without something pressing against my chest. And I dressed slowly, the unfamiliar clothes fitting better than I expected, like they had been chosen with intention, and that thought lingered longer than it should have. When I opened the bedroom door, the hallway beyond stretched out in quiet elegance, polished floors, muted colors, everything designed to feel effortless, and I stepped into it carefully, my footsteps almost too quiet to hear, as if the house itself demanded a certain level of restraint, and as I moved further, I began to notice the details, the way everything was maintained, the absence of clutter, the subtle presence of people who were there but not intrusive, moving in the background with practiced efficiency, acknowledging me with small nods but never asking questions. It was strange, being in a place where I was not invisible but also not interrogated, where my presence was accepted without explanation, and I did not know whether that made it easier or harder to trust. I followed the faint sound of movement until it led me to a larger room, open and bright, the early light spilling in through wide windows, and he was there, exactly where I expected and yet still surprising to see, seated at the far end of a long table, a cup of coffee in front of him, papers spread out in a way that suggested he had already been awake for hours, already moving through a day that I had barely stepped into. Adrian looked up as I entered, his gaze finding me instantly, and for a brief second I felt that same shift again, that subtle awareness that I was being seen, not judged, not dismissed, just observed in a way that felt deliberate, and I straightened slightly without meaning to, my shoulders pulling back as if preparing for something I could not name. "You found your way," he said, his voice calm, almost neutral, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like approval without saying the word, and I nodded, unsure of what response he expected from me, unsure of what role I was supposed to play in a place like this. I answered, my voice steadier than before, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with a quiet understanding that had not been there before, something unspoken but present, like a line had been drawn and crossed at the same time. He gestured slightly toward the chair across from him, a simple motion that carried the same quiet authority as everything else he did, and I hesitated only for a second before moving forward, because walking away no longer felt like the instinctive choice, not when something in me was starting to wonder what staying might actually mean, and as I sat down across from him, the distance between us measured and intentional, I realized that this was not just about being taken off the street, it was about being placed somewhere new, somewhere that would require me to decide who I was going to be next. There was something unsettling about how normal it felt to sit across from him, like I had stepped into a routine that had been waiting for me long before I arrived, and I kept my hands loosely folded in my lap, aware of every small movement, every glance, because nothing in this space felt accidental, not even the silence. The coffee in front of him let off a faint trail of steam, untouched, and I noticed the way his attention shifted between me and the documents on the table, never rushed, never distracted, like he could hold multiple things in place without losing control of any of them, and that kind of focus made it difficult to look away. "You should eat," he said after a moment, his voice cutting through the quiet without breaking it, and I followed his gaze to the place setting in front of me that I had not even noticed at first, a plate of food arranged simply but carefully, like it had been prepared with intention rather than display, and my stomach reacted before my pride could, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since I had eaten anything that did not come from a vending machine or a convenience store shelf. I hesitated, not because I did not want it, but because taking it felt like crossing another line, accepting something that I might not be able to give back, and I glanced at him briefly, searching for something in his expression that would tell me how this worked, what the rules were beyond the ones he had already given me, but he only watched, calm and unreadable, as if the decision was entirely mine. I reached for the fork slowly, my fingers steady despite the weight of the moment, and took a small bite, expecting something complicated, something I would have to pretend to understand, but it was simple, warm, real, and the normalcy of it hit me harder than anything else had so far, because it reminded me how far I had drifted from something as basic as sitting down and eating. Without looking over my shoulder, I did not realize how fast I was eating until I caught myself, forcing my movements to slow, to match the quiet rhythm of the room, and when I looked up again, his gaze was still on me, not intrusive, just observant, like he was noting details without making them feel like judgments, and that alone made my chest tighten in a way I could not fully explain. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" he asked, not as an accusation, not even as concern, just as a question that expected an honest answer, and I paused, the fork hovering slightly above the plate as I tried to calculate time in a way that made sense, days blending together until they stopped feeling separate. "I do not remember," I admitted quietly, and saying it out loud made it more real than I wanted it to be. There was no immediate response from him, no reaction that gave away what he thought about that answer, But I noticed the subtle shift again, the way his attention sharpened. Just slightly, like the information had been filed somewhere important. "You will," he said after a moment, and the certainty in his voice made it sound less like a guess and more like a decision, like he had already placed that future in front of me whether I was ready for it or not. I set the fork down for a second, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table as I studied him, trying to understand the boundaries of this arrangement, the limits of what he was offering without ever saying it directly, and I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far, because he was not asking for anything in return, not yet, not in any obvious way, and that made it harder to define what this was, harder to protect myself from something I could not clearly see. "Why me?" I asked finally, the question slipping out before I could filter it, because it had been there since the moment he stepped out of that car, since the moment he chose to stop instead of drive past like everyone else. His gaze held mine, steady and unflinching, and for a second I thought he might not answer, that he might leave it hanging like everything else, but then he leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression shifting just enough to show that he had considered this question before. "Because you were still there," he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it was not about pity, not about curiosity, it was about something else entirely, something I could not fully grasp yet, and as the words settled between us, I realized that whatever this was, whatever decision he had made that night, it had nothing to do with chance, and everything to do with something I had not yet understood. The answer stayed with me longer than it should have, not because it was complicated, but because it was not, and I found myself replaying it in my head even after the conversation drifted into silence again. "Because you were still there" meant something I could not quite define, something that felt less like coincidence and more like intention, and that realization settled into the space between us in a way that made everything else feel quieter. I picked up the fork again, finishing the last few bites more slowly now, not out of hesitation but because I was aware of being watched in a way that did not feel intrusive, just present, like he was cataloging who I was without asking me to explain it. And when I finally set the fork down, I realized I felt full, not just physically, but in a way I had not experienced in a long time, like something had been restored that I did not know I had lost. "Thank you," I said, the words coming out softer than I intended, but they were real, and I did not look away when I said them, because if there was one thing I understood, it was that gratitude meant more when it was not hidden. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging it without making it into something bigger than it was, and then his attention shifted, not away from me entirely, but toward the rhythm of his day, like he was allowing me to exist within it without forcing me into it. I sat there for a moment longer, unsure of what came next, because eating had been a clear step, a simple action with a beginning and an end, but now there was space again. And I was not used to having space without a problem attached to it. "What do you do?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out not as an accusation but as curiosity, because everything about him suggested structure, control, influence, but none of it had been explained, and I realized I needed context if I was going to understand the world I had stepped into. His gaze lifted slightly, meeting mine with that same steady focus, and for a second I thought he might deflect, might give me something vague, but instead he answered in a way that felt just as direct as everything else he had said. "I manage interests," he said, the word simple but layered in a way that suggested more beneath them, something he was choosing not to elaborate on, and I understood immediately that pressing further would not get me a clearer answer. "Not yet." I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that response settle, because even without details, it confirmed what I had already sensed, that this was not just a house, not just a man with resources. This was something larger, something structured in a way I had never been part of, and the realization brought a flicker of caution back into my chest, not enough to make me pull away, but enough to remind me that I needed to pay attention. "And now I am here," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, because the reality of it still felt unreal, like I was observing my own life from a distance instead of living it. "Now you are here," he repeated, his tone unchanged, but there was something in the way he said it that made it feel like a statement with weight, like being here was not just a location, it was a position, something that came with expectations I had not yet discovered. I stood slowly, the chair moving back with a soft sound against the floor, and for a moment I hesitated again, caught between the instinct to retreat to the safety of the room he had given me and the growing awareness that staying meant engaging with this place, understanding it, and possibly becoming part of it in ways I did not yet comprehend. "Can I look around?" I asked, the question careful, Because I did not know where the boundaries extended beyond what he had already told me, and I was not willing to cross them without knowing. He studied me for a second, not suspicious, just measuring, and then gave a small nod. "Within reason," he said, and the phrase was simple, but it carried the same quiet authority as everything else, a reminder that even freedom here had structure. I nodded in return, accepting that without argument, because I understood that boundaries were not something to push against blindly, not in a place like this. And as I turned to leave the room, stepping back into the hallway that now felt slightly less foreign than it had before, I realized that this was the first time in a long time that I was not just reacting to my life, I was choosing how to move through it, and that choice felt heavier than anything I had carried before. The hallway felt different this time, not because it had changed, but because I had, even if only slightly, and I walked slower than before, not out of hesitation but awareness, letting my eyes take in the details I had missed the first time, the subtle patterns in the walls, the quiet placement of art that looked like it had been chosen, not decorated, everything intentional, everything controlled. And it made me realize that this was not just a place someone lived in, it was a place someone had built to reflect exactly who they were. I passed a large window that overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out in clean lines of steel and glass, sunlight catching on surfaces that seemed miles away from the sidewalk I had been lying on just hours before, and for a moment I stopped, my reflection faint in the glass, led over a world that did not know I existed, and the contrast made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore, because I was standing between two lives that did not belong together, and somehow I had crossed from one into the other without understanding how or why. I kept moving, following instinct more than direction, until the space opened into another room, larger, quieter, lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books that looked untouched by dust but worn by use. And I hesitated at the threshold before stepping inside, because this felt different from the rest of the house, less about display and more about thought, like this was where decisions were made instead of shown. My fingers brushed lightly along the spines as I walked, not reading the titles so much as feeling the presence of them, the weight of knowledge, of time spent understanding things I had never had the luxury to think about. And I realized how far removed my life had been from something as simple as having time to sit and read without worrying about what came next. A soft sound behind me made me turn, not sharply, just enough to acknowledge it, and one of the staff members stood near the doorway, composed, respectful, not intrusive. "Miss Carter," she said gently, her tone neutral but not distant, and the sound of my name in this place still felt strange, like it had been placed somewhere it did not belong. "Yes," I answered, my voice steady, even though I was still adjusting to the idea that I could be addressed without suspicion or expectation. "Mr. Volkov asked that you inform us if you need anything," she continued, and I nodded, unsure what anything meant in a place like this, because my definition of need had been reduced to survival for so long that I did not know how to expand it beyond that. "I am fine," I said, and I meant it, at least in the most immediate sense, and she gave a small nod in return before stepping away, leaving the room as quietly as she had entered. Like her presence had been a moment, not an interruption. I turned back to the shelves, my attention drawn to a single book that stood slightly out of alignment with the rest, not enough to be obvious, just enough to catch my eye, and I reached for it without thinking, sliding it free and opening it to the first page, expecting something ordinary, but instead I found a small folded piece of paper tucked inside, worn at the edges like it had been handled more than once. I hesitated before unfolding it, a strange sense of intrusion settling over me, like I was about to step into something that was not meant for me, but curiosity has a way of pushing past hesitation, and when I finally opened it, the handwriting inside was sharp, precise, unmistakably deliberate, a single line written in ink that had not faded with time. "Not everything abandoned is meant to be lost," and the words hit me harder than they should have, because they felt too specific, too intentional, like they had been placed here for a reason I did not yet understand. I stood there for a moment, the paper held carefully between my fingers, my thoughts shifting in ways I could not fully track, because this was no longer just about being brought into a house, or being given food, or a place to sleep. This was something else, something deeper, something that suggested I was part of a pattern I had not yet seen. Slowly, I folded the paper back the way I had found it and slipped it into the book, returning it to the shelf with the same careful precision, but the feeling did not leave, that quiet sense that I had just crossed another invisible line, one that had less to do with space and more to do with understanding. As I stepped back, my eyes drifting once more to the window across the room where the city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, I realized something that settled into me with a quiet certainty, because whatever decision he had made that night, whatever reason he had for bringing me here, it was not finished, not even close, and for the first time since I had opened my eyes in this place, I was no longer just wondering what would happen next, I was beginning to feel like I was already part of it. I stood there longer than I realized, the quiet weight of that sentence lingering in my mind like it had found a place it refused to leave, and even after I stepped away from the shelf, the words followed me, not loud, not demanding, just present, like they had been waiting for someone to understand them. I moved back into the hallway slowly, my steps measured, my thoughts heavier now, because everything I had seen so far had felt controlled, deliberate, but this felt personal, like I had brushed against something that did not belong to the structure of the house, but to the person who built it. I did not know how long I walked, only that I eventually found myself back near the same room I had left, the quiet hum of activity behind closed doors, the faint rhythm of a place that functioned without chaos, and I paused just outside, not because I was unsure, but because I felt different than I had when I first walked away, like something had shifted in the way I saw all of this, in the way I saw him. When I stepped inside, Adrian was still there, though the papers had changed, the coffee replaced, the time moved forward without disrupting his focus, and for a moment I simply watched, not hiding it, not apologizing for it, because I realized something important. He had never asked me to be invisible here, not once. His eyes lifted as if he had felt the shift in the room before I made a sound, his attention finding me immediately, steady as always, but there was something else there now, something sharper, like he could tell that something had changed even if he did not know exactly what. You found something, he said, not a question, not a guess, just a quiet observation that landed with unsettling accuracy, and I felt my breath catch slightly before I steadied it, because that was the first time it felt like he was not just observing what I did, but what it meant. I took a step closer, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with intention the way everything in this place seemed to demand, and I met his gaze without looking away, because I had learned quickly that anything less would not go unnoticed. Why did you keep it? I asked, my voice calm but carrying something deeper now, something that had not been there before. Because I was no longer asking out of confusion, I was asking because I needed to understand the pattern I had become part of. His expression did not change immediately, but the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like it held something just beneath the surface, and when he finally leaned back slightly, his gaze did not leave mine, not even for a second, because some things are not meant to be forgotten, he said, and the answer was simple, but it was not empty. It carried weight. History, something I could not see but could feel, and I realized in that moment that whatever this was, whatever world I had stepped into, it was not built on impulse, it was built on memory. On decisions that lasted longer than the moment they were made. I let that settle, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table as I absorbed the meaning behind his words, and something inside me shifted again, not fear, not doubt, but awareness, because I was beginning to understand that I had not just been brought here to be saved, I had been brought here because I fit into something I had not yet seen, and me, I said,